Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back here to today's edition of Intuitive Angling, and really appreciate you guys swinging by the channel to check today's video out. Always appreciate that. And guys, today we're going to be talking about the difference and when you want to use and when you don't want to use a full-size jig over a little finesse jig. Now the answer on this is not as simple as what it seems. A lot of people say, well, just tough fishing conditions, you need to downsize your jig and not have a big one, but that's not true all the time. So I'm going to give you guys sort of my assessment on this as somebody who's fished jigs, for over 50 years. That way it'll hopefully allow you guys to make a good decision on your jig size next time you go fishing. And also guys, speaking of jigs, I just want to invite you to please check out my Blaukat Throwback Jig here that's available at Tackle Warehouse. I'll link my Throwback Jig and link in the description of this video. These are live rubber jigs that I designed for Cumberland Pro Lures. Live rubber jigs, hand-tied skirt, attention to detail on these things are second to none. And you will just definitely get more bites on a jig with a living rubber skirt. And they're hard to get. You don't see them. There's not very many of them out there. Not many companies make it because they're very labor intensive. So link in the description to my Throwback Jig there. Okay, I have got a lot of experience jig fishing. That's really how I learned to fish. Probably the first 10 years of my fishing that I ever did, starting back in the mid 70s to mid 80s when I was really heavily into learning about bass fishing. I had a chance to fish with some expert jig fishermen and expert jerkbait fishermen, and those were the two techniques that I really learned a lot. But I really fell in love with jig fishing simply because it was fun. I caught big fish on it, and I sort of became a student of jig fishing and tried to learn as much as I could about it. And in the process, I've learned a lot about jigs in terms of sizes, profiles, colors, trailers, head sizes, everything that goes into making a jig productive. Now, I want to talk about how to make the decision between the two of going to a small finesse jig versus a full-size jig, and we're going to get into that. And also, guys, I'm going to give you guys a little sneak peek on this. This isn't it here, but I'm in the process of designing a throwback finesse jig for Cumberland Pro Lures. This isn't it right here. We're almost finished with the design, but keep an eye out for that. I'll let you guys know when that finesse jig comes out that I'm helping build with Cumberland Pro Lures. Okay, here is my guideline as far as what I like to do with it. A lot of it has to do, hear me talk a lot about it, guys, the mood and the personality of the fish in relationship to the conditions. Now, here's the time that I use a full-size jig. Now, when I'm talking about a full-size jig, I'm talking about using a jig like this. It's got the long skirt that I don't really trim back, and I'm talking about using a larger profile trailer on it, something like this Zoom Big Super Chunk here. So this jig right here, this thing is probably close to 5 inches long. Whereas a little finesse jig like this, you're dealing with a trimmed down skirt and a shorter threaded on skirt, and this little thing is probably 2.5, maybe 3 inches long. So your finesse jigs are going to be considerably smaller in profile and size with that. Now, how I judge this, it has to do with the conditions I'm fishing and the time of the year. Personally, I have found in my own fishing that the time that a full-size jig works the best is any time that water temperature is really over about 55 degrees. Maybe low 50, something like that, 52 degrees and up. That is when I really like a full-size jig. If the water temperature is below, really below 55 degrees, a lot of times I'm going to a smaller jig. It's just what the bass prefer a little bit with that. The second with that is my cover consideration. A full-size jig like this is my choice if I'm fishing a little bit denser cover. So if I'm fishing a jig in flooded cover, like flooded bushes and trees, I go with a full-size jig a lot of times. Boat docks, lay down trees, grass beds, lily pads, something that has some type of a thicker cover for the fish to be in. Seems like I always get more bites on a full-size jig with that. Another time is the weather conditions. If the weather is nasty, like it's cloudy and windy, rainy, something like that, I get more bites on a full-size jig. I like to use a full-size jig a lot of times, sometime in the summertime too, if I'm dealing with really dirty water, like the water visibility is under 12 inches. Even if I'm fishing more sparser cover like a stump, sometimes that dirty water can compensate for that sparser cover. So flipping lay down trees and stuff in the summertime and dirty water is a good way to fish it. That's sort of my guideline with it. Now the finesse jig, On the opposite end of the spectrum, this is a jig I like to use if the water temperatures are cold and the water's a little bit cleaner. So finesse jig is my choice if that water temperature specifically is below 55 degrees and you have water visibilities of over about 2.5 feet. You can get bites on a finesse jig in dirty water, but a full-size jig is a little bit better. So therefore, that finesse jig is going to be a really key player for me from about late October into April or something like that. That's when I really use a finesse jig quite a bit. The only exception to that, and one of the few times that I use a finesse jig in warmer water, is if I'm fishing docks that have piling docks, not floating docks, but piling docks, like you guys have on tidal river lakes or TVA lakes or lake like Lake Murray or Lake Lake Norman, Lake Murray, something like that. Piling docks with a finesse jig is pretty good in warm water, but for the most part it's that clear, colder water. And also, just like the opposite of a full-size jig, when I'm fishing a jig around sparser cover, a finesse jig is my #1 jig choice if I'm fishing around rock, which I do like to fish a jig around rock a lot. So if I'm fishing a channel bank or a riprap bank or a bluffy bank, finesse jig's my choice. I don't hardly ever fish a full-size jig just on pure straight rock, unless maybe it's some dirty water. But the time to me, guys, if you gave me one situation where a little finesse jig excels at, it would be fishing where you have water visibility of, say, 3 to 6 foot and some type of a chunk rock or bluff bank. Just pitching that jig to the bluffy chunk rock banks, little finesse jig is a really, really good way to catch them there. And finally, just like we talked about at the first of the video, sometimes under really tough fishing conditions where you have high fishing pressure, say the lake's getting pounded, the fish are seeing a lot of lures, tough fishing conditions like high light intensity, bluebird skies, not much wind, sometimes downsizing to a little finesse jig is going to get you more bites on a bigger jig. But thing about it, guys, is when you are not saying you can't catch big fish on a finesse jig, but you're going to sacrifice size by going down in a smaller jig. So a big jig, you may not get as many bites on it, but your fish may weigh a pound bigger than on a finesse jig. So it's sort of weighing out the difference between quality versus quantity of bites. But that's just a real brief foundational, guidelines about how I choose a finesse jig over a full-size jig. And I sort of think if you adopt that in your fishing, it'll help you guys get more jig bites. So hope it works out. We'll talk later.